We are looking today at Parshas Korach, which can be found if you're in the Stone Chumash on page 8. Well, it starts on page 820, beginning of chapter 16 in Bamidbar. And we are going to begin near the beginning. Of course, Parshas Korach is dominated by the uprising of Korach himself, and Korach had several co-conspirators who are mentioned by name, as well as 250 who are described in a general way as prominent people, not identified by name. But let's begin at the beginning, and then we look particularly at the pasuk where Baal haTurim has some insights to share with us. Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahas ben Levi. He took something, doesn't say what he took or who he took. Rashi says he, so to speak, took himself in hand and he undertook, we would say, to challenge the authority of Moshe and Aharon, as is well known. We also mentioned, the Torah mentions Dasan va'aviram, Bnei Eliyav, who are from the tribe of Reuven, and also On ben Peles. Now, On ben Peles drops out. We don't hear more about him. There's a well-known medrash about how he actually reconsidered at the urging of his wife or the machinations of his wife. But definitely Dasan and Aviram play an active role, and as we'll see, they were particularly forthright and we would say insolent in their challenge to Moshe. So it says, Vayakumu lifnei Moshe, they stood up against Moshe, before Moshe, together with 250 prominent personalities. V'ikalu in pasuk Gimel al Moshe val Aharon. They gathered around. They sort of made a public spectacle. It may well be that in addition to the 250, that also attracted interest and support from many other members of Klal Yisrael. So it's apparent that it wasn't just those people alone, but rather there was a groundswell of support for them, or maybe hostility or opposition to Moshe and to Aharon, and perhaps we'll see why that might be in one moment. Anyway, it says, "Vayikalu al Moshe val Aharon v'yomar lehem rav lechem." It's enough. You have arrogated to yourselves enough authority. Everyone is holy. The whole congregation is holy. God is in their midst. And why have you elevated yourselves? Why have you elevated yourselves above the congregation of God? Of course, we who have been reading the Torah are perhaps surprised at, again, not just the arrogance, but also the falsification, because there's no indication that Moshe and Aharon lorded their authority. Of course, it was all at the divine command. But, of course, Korach and his cohorts did not see it that way. Interestingly, Moshe right away, opposes them and faces them down. Tomorrow morning, Hashem will demonstrate who is righteous and who is not righteous. So we go ahead a few more psukim, and we see the particular allegation of Dasan and Aviram. So we find that in pasuk Yud Beis on page 822, if you're with me in the Stone Chumash or whatever Chumash you're using, Vayishlach Moshe lekol Dasan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav v'yamru lo na'aleh. We're not going up to you. Rashi says that without meaning to do so, they said something that was very true. They're not going up, they're only going down to the depths of the earth. But of course, that wasn't what they had in mind. They said, we're not going to respond to your summons. And they said the following, they sent back the following insolent message, or maybe they said it in person. Is it a small matter that you have brought us up from a land flowing with milk and honey, to bring about our deaths in the wilderness? You want to lord your authority upon us as well. Now this was, of course, a deliberate taunt, because Moshe had promised them to take them to a land flowing with milk and honey, but they're saying, compared to this wilderness, compared to this desert where we are going to languish until our dying day, you took us from a very productive and verdant, wealthy, prosperous land, the land of Egypt, which was prosperous, because the Nile would flood in the spring, and it would bring great wealth and prosperity to Egypt. Maybe not the entire country of Egypt, but the Nile Delta. and they call that the land of Zavas Chalav Udvash, but they take it further. Af lo al eretz Zavas Chalav Udvash osanu. You haven't brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey. You told us you would, and you've been a bust. Vatiten lanu nachala sada v'charem, and giving us, in accordance with your promise, an inheritance of field and vineyard. Those are the words really that I wanted to comment upon. What we've said for the last few minutes is by way of context. Even if you would gouge out the eyes of those men, we shall not go up. So Moshe summoned them, and they said, we're not coming up to you, and we've got no intention of doing so. You took us from a land flowing in milk and honey. You have not brought us to a land flowing in milk and honey. You're leaving us to languish until our dying days here in the wilderness. And then he concludes, will you gouge out the eyes of those men? Who are those men? So it's a bit unclear. The Art Scroll renders it, even if you would gouge out the eyes of those men, probably, al derech hapshat, the reference is, it is a way of saying, even if you were to gouge out our eyes, we're not coming up, meaning we're not going to yield to your authority in any way. And the reason it says Anashim Haim, because a person doesn't want to even express as a possibility misfortune to himself. So therefore, in a euphemistic way, they say those people, but really they mean themselves. That is to say, even if you were to threaten us with such a punishment or such a torture, we're not going to yield. We're going to have it out with you. Says the Baal HaTurim, an interesting thing, the word ha'ene, which is like it's with the word he, with the letter he hatimiha, it's a rhetorical he. Ha'ene, again, the Art Scroll render it, even if you gouge out the eyes of those men, like we would translate it, do you hope to gouge out the eyes of those men? It's a rhetorical he. Interestingly, the Baal HaTurim tells us that the word ha'ene appears one other place in the Tanakh. There's one other place in all of the scriptures in which that word appears. Ha'ene anashim ha'em ve'idach ha'ene basar lach. Do you have eyes of flesh? Now, where is that pasuk to be found? It's found in the book of Job, where the reference is to God himself. Eov says to Hashem, you are not limited by the perception of flesh and blood. You perceive the future. You perceive the entirety of the human experience, or indeed all of the affairs of the universe itself. So therefore, he says rhetorically, "Ha'enei basarlach." Do you have eyes of flesh? So says the Baal HaTurim that this alludes to the fact that when Dasan and Aviram said, Ha'enei ha'neshim tinaker, he says, Baal HaTurim uses the words, Hitichu dvarim klape mala. They were alluding to the idea that they were saying, do you think you can blind God? Do you think that you can hoodwink God to remain as your champion when in fact you have betrayed your mission? You've promised the nation that you're going to take them to a land flowing with milk and honey, and you haven't done so, and everybody can see that. We realize that we have been condemned to die in the desert, and therefore, according to Baal HaTurim, the remez is that they said Hanashim Hahem, which I said al derech hapshat. It means not us. It means us. But they say those people because a person doesn't want to even express, to articulate something, to verbalize some misfortune for himself. So he's cast it on some other anonymous third party. But says the Baal HaTurim, at a deeper level, it means that they were saying to Moshe, are you proposing to blind God? By the way, the word Satan, which is in English Satan, is the Malach HaMaves, he's the angel of death, and he's the tempter, he's the one who leads man astray. But in the rabbinic literature, we find another name as well, which is Samael. It's the same concept, Samael. Samael means the one who blinds God, or more correctly, who blinds man from seeing God. So the idea that Hashem is blind, it's a way of saying, do you imagine that you can somehow conduct your affairs and escape the divine scrutiny? They're seizing the high ground. That is to say, they are accusing Moshe of duplicity or disloyalty, and they're saying we are the ones who are faithful to Hashem. And that is a very subtle and, of course, a very sharp rebuke that they're advancing to Moshe. This is alluded to in the word ha'enei, which, as we said, appears only in one other place in Tanakh, where it's a reference to Hashem. Ha'enei basar lach. Then he says, the Baal HaTurim goes on to say, but lefi hapshat, that they were saying, do you mean to treat us as if we were blind? Meaning we can see what you've done. So Baal HaTurim suggests the idea of gouging out their eyes, it's a way of saying, do you think that we are blind? Do you think that we haven't noticed how you have betrayed your mission? And that, again, is strengthened by their deliberate transposition of the land flowing with milk and honey by saying, you've taken us from a verdant and productive and rich and desirable, prosperous land, and you've brought us to this wretched desert, and you certainly have not fulfilled your promise of bringing us to the land flowing with milk and honey. Just want to mention, just parenthetically, since we're talking about Dasan v'Aviram, and we see here their language, which is so insolent and so shrewd, and again, so aggressive. How is it that these people, okay, Korach, we know Korach was a Levi, he had great yichus, he had a great ego as well, but in a way, Korach has more to bring to the table. He was among those who carried the Aron, and even though in accordance with his greatness was his villainy, but we see his greatness. Dasan Avrim, what do they bring to the table? They are scoundrels. They are we see how they joined with Korach as full partners in this insurrection. Moreover, you may be aware that according to our tradition, according to rabbinic tradition, when Moshe was a young man, when he first stepped out into Egypt, went out from the palace, and he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and he saved the slave, the Hebrew slave, by killing the taskmaster, and he buried him in the sand. He went out the next day and he saw two Hebrews who were fighting, and it says, "Vayomer la'Rasha lama sekere'echa," why are you striking your mate? And he said to him, "Halahargeni ata omer," do you propose to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Who are these two? The Torah doesn't say, but according to rabbinic tradition, this was Dasan v'Aviram, the same two scoundrels. Moreover, they were the same ones who were guilty of gathering the man when they weren't supposed to gather it, or rather, they gathered a double portion. And Moshe said, "Go collect day by day; don't leave it over till the morning," and they did. We find, according to Chazal, that Dasan v'Aviram were the same ne'er-do-wells again and again, repeatedly, and it makes us wonder, how did they ever get out of Mitzrayim? After all, again, according to Chazal, it's not explicit in the Torah, but according to the very well-known tradition, that 4/5 of the Jewish people perish in Mitzrayim, and only the more worthy fifth were the ones who were redeemed, and those who were undeserving, they perish in Mitzrayim. How did these guys get out? Surely they would have been near the bottom of the pecking order. They would have been among the first to be punished with death in Mitzrayim. So I believe the Meshech Chachma is the one who says it's true that they were scoundrels, and we find explicitly here and again, according to Chazal earlier. But the ones who died in Mitzrayim primarily shared one quality, and that is they didn't really want to leave. They were too happy in Mitzrayim, or at least they were too contented, or maybe they were lacking they had a paucity of imagination. They had they were so spiritually stultified, they could not imagine or envision or aspire to a better life. And if they wanted to stay in Mitzrayim, those are the ones who indeed were destined to remain behind. The ones who left were the ones who wanted to go into the land of Israel. Dasan and Aviram, although they were villains, but one thing we can say for them, they wanted to get to the land of Israel. We see here, although they did it, their words were advanced in a hateful way, in a vengeful way, in an insolent way, in an aggressive way, in an antagonistic way. But nevertheless, they do express the grave disappointment and frustration that they're not going to enter the land of Israel, and they yearn for Nachala Sada v'Cherem. So it could well be that this is the merit through which they were able to leave Mitzrayim. Of course, they perished because of this, their role in the insurrection, but at least this sheds light on how it is they survived until this point, because underlying their anger and their aggression, and no doubt their greed and envy and their power, their hunger for power, but with all of that is also a desire to enter the land of Israel. And for that, they deserve credit, and that's why they left. They were zocha, they merited to leave Mitzrayim in the first place. Okay, I want to share with you a further thought on a later pasuk. Take a look at pasuk Yud Zayin. I'm sorry, Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17, pasuk Gimel, verse 3. So, just for myself, here we read, Esmachtos hachataim ha'ila. I guess we'll look at the context for a moment as well. Hashem says to Moshe, Emor Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen v'yarim es hamachtos mi ben hasreifa v'sa'esh zrei hala, to separate the fire pans and scatter the fire, the coals, ki kadesha, they've become sanctified. Eis machtos hachataim ha'ile benafshosam, the fire pans of these sinners against their souls. Hachataim ha'ile benafshosam, vasuosam rikui pachim tzipui lamizbech. Okay, we have a certain, the Hashem instructs that they should be used for a certain purpose, which is interesting unto itself because it's a holy purpose, and the people who were using the fire pans died because they were challenging the authority of Moshe, and they were suggesting that Aharon has no special claim on sanctity, and we can also offer the incense, which did not end well for them. But what haTurim draws attention to is this turn of phrase, hachataim ha'ele benafshosam, these who sin against their souls. Hachatim ha'ele benafshosam. It's an interesting turn of phrase, and wouldn't you know, it appears only in one other place in the Torah. Hachataim es Amalek. That is the other place the expression appears. Hachataim es Amalek. These sinful people, Amalek, which is found in the book of Shmuel. It's not in the Torah, the Chumash, but it's a later iteration of the Amalek, the same people, that is to say, the same nation, centuries later, in the days of Shaul, the days of Shmuel, and there Shmuel refers to Chataim Amalek, these wicked people, the people of Amalek. So says the Baal HaTurim, what's the significance of the fact that the Torah here describes the conspirators, the participants in the uprising of Korach, these 250 supporters of Korach, describes them as Hachataim ha'ila benafshosam, and the fact that we find that the same word is used only in one other place with regard to Amalek. What common feature do they have? Of course, they share villainy, they share opposition to the holiness of the Jewish people, but there's something further that they have in common, and that is that they both had plenty of opportunity to learn of the error and the futility of their ways. Amalek is famous for being the first nation to attack the Jewish people after they left Egypt, after the Egyptian hordes were drowned in the sea, after the Jewish people had emerged in dry land on the other side, freed forevermore from Egyptian bondage. They received a lump sum payment for generations of servitude, so they were rich. They had wealth. They had the divine favor. They themselves had witnessed these miracles, and according to tradition, in fact, it's almost explicit in the Torah itself, all the other nations knew about it as well. Ele Moav Yochazema Ra'ad. When the waters of the sea split, it was a dramatic moment, a dramatic occasion for all of mankind. Amalek too. Nevertheless, Amalek came to attack the Jewish people, and he refers to the Baal HaTurim refers to the famous comment of Rashi that Amalek became like a human ice cube, can be compared to a bath which is very hot. It's too hot for anybody to get into, but some impetuous person jumps in anyway. What happens to him? Of course, he gets scalded. What happens to the water? He cools it down. So the Jewish people as well, when they left Mitzrayim, who could attack them? Who could think of contending with them? No one. But Amalek did it anyway. Did he realize that he was doomed? Probably did. It would be difficult to imagine that he didn't. Korach and his people were the same. They had experienced what we have only read about in the Torah. If it's familiar to us, imagine their interaction, their experience of having witnessed and having participated in all of the miracles, the leadership, the unerring, faithful leadership of Moshe, and still they attacked Moshe. Still they sought to supplant Moshe. This is a similar impulse. It's the impulse of Amalek, and it's the impulse of Korach. Amalek, we say, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot to it, but at the simple level it is, Amalek was motivated by hatred. Hatred of the Jewish people, maybe hatred of the God of Israel. Korach was motivated not so much by hatred, but by jealousy, envy, greed, a feeling of a desire to push aside someone else who he feels has too much prestige and he wants a cut of the action. Both of those impulses, whether we say envy and greed on the one hand, hatred on the other hand, are you could say two sides of the same coin, or however you want to characterize it, in other ways perhaps as well. Both those phenomena, those drives, can make a person mad, can cause a person to lose all perspective and lose all rationality. I don't want to go down that path, but many have speculated that Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemo v'Zichro, was an embodiment of that kind of obsession, where his hatred for the Jewish people actually undermined his own war effort. I don't have time for that. It's a separate shir. We may actually speak about that for those who are with us on Shivasar B'Tammuz at Kesher in person in the evening of towards the last hour or so of the fast of Tammuz. We're going to speak about the enigma of anti-Semitism, history and theology. Very worthwhile shir, if I can say so myself. So we find that Amalek and Korach and his people share that common obsession, and they have essentially, they've been the hatred on the one hand, the greed on the other hand, the envy have caused them to bring about their own downfall when they knew very well that they were doomed. I want to add another thing, which actually Baal HaTurim doesn't say. The word benafshosam, who sin with their souls or against their souls. So the simple meaning is that they sin against their souls, meaning they are going to bring about their total death. There's a machlokas in the Gemara whether Korach has any portion in the world to come, for all of his worthiness and all of his achievements and all of his capabilities and all of his righteousness even. He ruined it all, he spoiled it all, he lost it all, benafshosam, he sins against his soul. I want to add something further, which Baal HaTurim doesn't say, and that is the word nefesh, which means soul, also means desire. When Abraham is addressing the Bnei Ches, the municipal authorities in Hebron, and he wants to acquire a burial plot for Sarah, he says, Im yeshes nafshechem, if you if you will, if you have the will. And by the way, I think we can say that Korach and Amalek were willful sinners. It means they sinned in a willful manner, in a deliberate manner, and almost, like I say, in an obsessive manner, bringing about their own death. But In a similar way, Rashi says, Im yeshes nafshechem, it means im yesh ritzonchem, if you desire. Nefesh also means desire. Im yeshes nafshechem. So it says, hachatim ha'ile benafshosam, they are sinning with their souls, with their desire, meaning their desire for like I said, their greed and their envy, their jealousy has caused them to lose all sense of not just propriety, but all sense of rationality, having seen Moshe's leadership, etc. And as we said before, as Baal haTurim says, Amalek has a similar impulse. In the minutes we have left, I want to share with you a final thought. Very interesting word that it's one of the words that I always remember, because the meaning of the word in Hebrew is very different than the meaning of the word in English. Not surprising, because Hebrew and English are completely different languages, but it's a word which has a, well, it happens to be an English word as well, so to speak, that sounds the same way. I hope you're curious. Page 830, look at Pasuk Chaf Hey. Vayma Hashem el Moshe hashev es matei Aharon lifnei ha'idus lemishmeres laos livnei Meri. Meri means rebels. It's like ben sorer umoreh, a wayward and rebellious son. The ben sorer umoreh, or a zaken mamre is a similar word, a rebellious one. Livnei Meri means those who are rebellious. So in the English, we can translate it that as a safekeeping, as a sign for rebellious ones. Lifnaidus limishmeres laos livnei Meri. Who are the rebellious ones? The Jewish people are rebellious. They are rebellious because not only Korach and his supporters, they already are history already by this point, but even the people afterwards, they blame Moshe. They said, "Atem amisim esam Hashem." They still felt that Moshe was somehow the aggressor here, a bit like Israel and Iran. They felt that Moshe is the aggressor, and therefore they were punished as well. And finally, then you have the sign of the staff of Aharon. But what interests me is this turn of phrase, laos livnei Meri. Meri doesn't mean happy, like Merry Thanksgiving. It doesn't mean it. It means rebelliousness, livnei Meri. So, okay, this is Pashut Pshat. I haven't told you anything you don't know yet. Says the Baal haTurim, he says maybe this is where Moshe learned to call them Morim. Morim, when did Moshe call them Morim? So Moshe said, Miyom adat yasem mamrim ha'isim es Hashem. You have just read you because it's only a very short comment. Mikan lamad Moshe shekara'am mamrim. Hashem said, "Los livnei Meri," the Jewish people who are rebellious. So says Baal haTurim, from here Moshe learned that he called them mamrim. Now the interesting thing is that the Torah uses the word mamrim a few times. When in Devarim we find that Moshe said, "Mamrim hayisem im Hashem." Miyom dat yeschem mamrim hayisem im Hashem. 3 times in the book of Devarim. You have been rebellious with God. So it could be that that's what the Baal haTurim is referring to. That Moshe called them mamrim. How did he take it upon himself to call them that? Because it says here, livnei Meri, Hashem himself said, which I found very interesting. As I said, that word Meri, it's always kind of struck me of the irony of it because of the difference in the Hebrew meaning and the English meaning. But Baal haTurim drew my attention to the fact that maybe this is how Moshe got the idea to call them mamrim, mamrim eisim Hashem. Now, the only thing is, there's another possible meaning in the Baal haTurim. Even though it says shekara'am mamrim, but there are those who have a different girsa. They suggest maybe the Baal haTurim is referring to something slightly different. Not mamrim, but a different form of the same word, morim. Morim. It's the same word, but it's just a slightly different form of it. When did Moshe call the Jewish people morim, which means rebellious ones? When he said, Shim'u na hamorim. That's in next week's Parasha. In next week's Parsha, when Miriam dies, the well dries up and the people are thirsty, and Moshe is instructed by Hashem to take his staff and speak to the rock. And he says, Shimuna Hamorim, listen up, you rebels. And according to the Rambam, that was his great transgression, because he called the Jewish people Morim. So it could be that the Baal haTurim is saying that Moshe got the idea of calling the Jewish people Morim, rebels, because Hashem himself in our Parsha says, La'oslim Meri. If that's the case, what was so wrong with what he did? After all, we see right here, Hashem says the Jewish people are rebellious, and Moshe said, Shimuna Hamorim, listen up, you rebels. The Mefarshim explain there is a difference. There's a difference between what the Torah says here, a sign for those who might be rebellious, or those who were rebellious or are rebellious, but it's in principle. When Moshe says to the Jewish people, Mamrim Hayisem, you rebelled against God, that's also rebuking them for what they did. But what Moshe says in next week's Parsha, Shimona Hamorim, is much worse. They say that's a pshat what the Rambam means. The Rambam says that when you call someone a rebel, it's different than saying you have acted in a rebellious way. Because you characterize him, you identify him as a rebel, and that is a more offensive turn of phrase. Perhaps we'll speak about that in next week's parsha when we get there. But anyway, this is what I would like to suggest. Perhaps the Baal haTurim means when he says Mikan lamad Moshe. So Moshe learned it, but his application of the idea, valid though it was wrong. He should not have addressed the Jewish people and condemned them in that kind of language. Okay, so we've had 3 interesting comments of Baal haTurim. Thank you to everyone, and I wish you a wonderful Shabbos, Chodesh Tov, and may we only hear good news in the week ahead.